Thalric Voss and I had never seen a weapon fired in his entire life.
And he was not ashamed of that fact, because his species, the Cathari, had not fought a war in over 4,000 years, and they considered that their greatest achievement above all others. He stood in the reception chamber of the Concordance High Council, with his hands folded behind his back, and his translucent skin glowing faintly blue, which was the color of nervousness among his kind. And he tried very hard to stop it, but he could not, because he had just been told something that made his stomach turn inside out. Senior Analyst Dremic stood across from him, tall and pale and ancient, with the tired eyes of someone who had seen too many reports about too many dead civilizations. He spoke in that flat voice he always used when delivering bad news. "You are being deployed as a neutral military observer aboard a human warship," Dremic said. "The Concordance needs intelligence on Vraxian fleet capabilities and tactics, and the humans are about to provide us with a perfect opportunity to gather that intelligence, because they are about to be destroyed." Thalric blinked his 4 eyes one pair at a time, which was a Cathari expression of confusion. "The humans, sir?" "Yes, the humans," Dremic said, and he pulled up a holographic display showing a region of dead stars and broken planets known as the Shroud Expanse. "A Vraxian hive fleet of approximately 80 warships is moving toward a human colony world called Mara's Landing, and the humans are sending a battle group to intercept them." Thalric studied the display and his skin shifted from blue to a darker shade. "How many ships are the humans sending?" 12. Thalric stared at Dremic for a long time, waiting for him to correct himself, or to laugh, or to say he was joking. But Dremic did none of those things, because Dremic never joked about anything. 12 ships against 80, Thalric said slowly. Dremic said, "Which is why this will be a short assignment, and you should pack light, and also prepare yourself emotionally, because you will almost certainly be witnessing the complete destruction of the human force, and possibly your own death, although we have negotiated a diplomatic protection charter that should allow the Vraxians to let you leave alive after the battle, assuming they honor it, which they sometimes do and sometimes do not." Thalric felt his skin go completely white, which was the color of fear. "Sir, with respect, why me?" Dremic looked at him with something that might have been pity. "Because you are young and expendable, and because no senior analyst wants this assignment, and because the council needs someone there, and you are at the bottom of the list, Thalric, and I am sorry, but that is the truth." 3 days later, Thalric stood in the docking bay of a transit station, watching a human shuttle approach, and he realized he had never actually seen a human vessel up close before, and his first thought was that it looked angry somehow, as if the metal itself was irritated about something. The shuttle was not elegant the way Cathari ships were elegant, with their smooth curves and soft light, and it was not grand the way Vraxian ships were grand, with their massive organic hulls that looked like the shells of enormous insects. Instead, the human shuttle was blocky and sharp, and covered in scorch marks and dents and patches where damage had been repaired, not with grace, but with a kind of stubborn refusal to stop working. A human pilot waved at him from the cockpit window, and Thalric waved back uncertainly, and then walked aboard. The inside of the shuttle smelled strange, and it took Thalric a moment to identify the smell as a combination of metal and sweat and something else, something chemical and harsh, that he later learned was called coffee, and humans apparently needed it to function in the morning, which he found deeply concerning. The flight to the human flagship took 2 hours, and when they arrived, Thalric pressed his face to the viewport and got his first look at the ISV Relentless. It was enormous, much larger than he expected, and covered in weapons, so many weapons, and he counted gun turrets and missile batteries and point defense clusters, and then he stopped counting because the numbers were making him uncomfortable, and his skin was doing that white fear thing again. The shuttle docked with a heavy metallic clang, and the doors opened, and Thalric stepped out into the main hangar of the Relentless, and immediately he knew something was wrong. Not wrong exactly, but different and deeply strange. There were humans everywhere, hundreds of them, moving with purpose and energy and noise. So much noise they were shouting to each other and laughing and carrying equipment, and some of them were running, not because there was an emergency, but apparently because they just felt like running. And Thalric stood there in the middle of all this chaos and felt like a small fish that had accidentally swum into a river of sharks. And then she appeared. Captain Lucia Vargas walked toward him through the crowd, and the crowd parted for her, not because she pushed through, but because they moved without thinking, the way water moves around a stone. And she was not tall by human standards, but she carried herself as if she were the largest thing in any room she entered. She had dark hair pulled back tight, and dark eyes that looked at Thalric the way a scientist looks at something under a microscope. And there were scars on her hands, old scars, white and faded, and her smile when it came did not reach her eyes, not even close. "Observer Voss and I," she said, and her voice was calm and clear, and completely unbothered by the chaos around her. "Welcome aboard the Relentless." "Thank you, Captain," Thalric said, and his voice came out higher than he wanted it to. "Be here, and I will do my best to stay out of your way during the coming engagement." She tilted her head slightly. "You read the tactical briefing?" "I did," he said. 12 ships against 80. "That is correct." Thalric paused, and then, because he could not help himself, he asked, "Are you not concerned about the odds, Captain?" Something changed in her face then. Something subtle and fast, like a shadow passing behind her eyes. And for just a moment, Thalric saw something that made every instinct in his body scream at him to run. And it was gone as quickly as it came, and she smiled again, that same empty smile. "The odds are fine, observer," she said. "Try to keep up." She turned and walked away, and Thalric stood there in the hangar, surrounded by hundreds of human soldiers, and he noticed something that made his blood go cold. None of them were afraid. He had expected fear and anxiety and dread, because that is what any rational species would feel when facing a force that outnumbered them nearly 7-1. But there was no fear on this ship, and there was no dread, and there was no quiet acceptance of death. Instead, there was something else, something he had no word for in the Cathari language, something bright and hot and hungry that burned behind every pair of human eyes he looked into. They were eager. These humans were actually eager for what was coming, and they wanted it, and they were looking forward to it, the way a predator looks forward to the hunt. And Thalric stood in the middle of that hunger and felt very small and very alone and very far from home. He opened his datapad with shaking hands and began his first entry. "Day 1, he wrote. "I have boarded the human vessel, and I must report an initial observation that concerns me greatly, and that the concordance may not be prepared to hear. I do not think we have correctly understood what humans are." Thalric spent the next 3 days aboard the Relentless, trying to understand the humans, and failing completely. And the more he watched them, the less he understood. And the less he understood, the more afraid he became. On the first morning, he walked through the lower decks to observe the soldiers in their daily routine. And what he found made him stop in the doorway and stare with all 4 of his eyes wide open. They were fighting each other, not with weapons, although there were plenty of weapons everywhere on this ship, but with their bare hands and feet and elbows and knees, and they were doing it in a cleared section of the cargo bay on padded mats, and there was blood on those mats, and he could see that some of the soldiers had bruises on their faces and split lips, and one woman had a cut above her eye that was bleeding freely down her cheek. And she was laughing. She was laughing and wiping the blood away with the back of her hand, and then she went right back in and hit the man she was fighting, so hard that he stumbled sideways and crashed into the wall. And he was laughing too, and Thalric felt his skin go pale, and he wrote in his notes, The humans practice violence against each other for recreation, and they appear to enjoy it, and I find this deeply disturbing. Later that same day, he passed through the armory and stopped again because a group of Marines were sitting in a circle on the floor, doing something he could not immediately identify. And when he looked closer, he saw that they were sharpening knives. Not energy blades or plasma cutters, but actual metal knives with edges that caught the light and gleamed. And one of the Marines, a young man with a shaved head and tattoos covering both arms, noticed Thalric staring, and held up his knife with a grin. "Want to see?" the Marine asked. "I am curious," Thalric said carefully. "You carry plasma rifles and energy weapons, and yet you maintain these primitive blades. Wonder why?" The Marine looked at his knife, and then back at Thalric, and his grin got wider. "Plasma runs out," he said simply. Thalric wrote that down and underlined it 3 times. On the second evening, he was walking through the barracks level when he heard something that physically hurt him, and it was sound, but not like any sound he had ever experienced, and it was loud and aggressive and rhythmic, and it shook the walls and made his teeth ache, and his translator struggled with it and kept flickering between interpretations. He later learned it was called music, and the specific type was called heavy metal. And the humans listened to it before combat, the way the Kethari listened to harmonic meditation chants before diplomatic sessions. Except instead of calming the mind, it seemed designed to set the mind on fire. He also noticed that the soldiers told stories to each other constantly, and the stories were always about previous battles and previous injuries. They would show each other their scars and compare them and argue about whose wound was worse and whose recovery was harder. And they did this not with shame or sadness, but with pride and with laughter, as if being damaged and surviving was something to celebrate. On the third day, Captain Vargas called a full briefing in the tactical center, and Thalric attended and stood in the back and watched and listened. The room was packed with officers and senior enlisted soldiers, and Vargas stood at the front with a holographic display of the shroud expanse behind her, and she laid out the situation in that calm, clear voice that never seemed to change, no matter what she was saying. The Vraxian Hive Fleet consists of approximately 80 warships, including 12 carrier-class vessels, each carrying between 500 and 800 fighter drones, she said. They are heading for Mara's landing, and their estimated time of arrival is 41 hours, and the colony has a population of 1.2 million civilians with no meaningful orbital defense. She paused and looked around the room, and every eye was on her. "We are 12 ships," she continued. "We are outgunned and outmassed, and by every standard tactical model in the galaxy, we should turn around and run, and let the Vraxians have the colony." Nobody moved, and nobody spoke, and Thalric noticed that not a single person in the room looked surprised or worried, and they were waiting for something, and he could feel it in the air, like static electricity building before a storm. "We are not going to do that," Vargas said, and her voice dropped lower and harder. "We are going to intercept the Vraxian fleet in the Shroud Expanse, and we are going to attack first, and we are going to hit them so hard and so fast that they will not have time to understand what is happening to them." The room erupted, and it was not panic, and it was not protest, and it was something that Thalric had no framework for. Process, because these soldiers who were outnumbered 7-1 actually cheered, and some of them slammed their fists on tables, and some of them grinned at each other with those terrifying human grins that showed their teeth. After the briefing, Thalric requested a private meeting with Vargas, and she agreed, and they sat across from each other in her quarters, and he tried very carefully to say what he needed to say. "Captain," he began, "I must speak plainly, and I hope you will not take offense." "Go ahead, observer." "Every tactical model available to the Concordance suggests that engaging a force this size with your numbers will result in total destruction of your battle group. And I must respectfully suggest that withdrawal is the logical course of action." She looked at him, and there it was again, that expression he had seen on the first day, and it was patient and calm and slightly sad, as if she were explaining something very simple to someone who should already understand it. "Observer," she said, "there are 1.2 million people on Mars landing, and most of them are families and children and farmers and teachers, and they have nothing between them and the Vraxians except us. And if we leave, they will all die, every single one of them, and the Vraxians will eat them alive, because that is what Vraxians do." "I understand that, Captain, but surely the strategic calculation—" "There is no calculation," she said, and her voice was quiet, but it hit him like a wall. "We do not leave people behind, and that is not a tactic, and that is not a strategy, and that is what we are. And if you want to understand humans, Observer, then write that down, because it is the most important thing I will ever tell you." He wrote it down. Later that night, he found Sergeant Major Kofi Asante sitting alone in an observation lounge, staring out at the stars, and the big man did not seem surprised to see him, and simply gestured to the empty seat beside. They sat in silence for a long time, and then Falric asked, "Sergeant Major, how do your people do this? And how do you face something like what is coming, and not break apart?" Asante was quiet for a moment, and then he spoke in that deep, slow voice that rumbled like distant thunder. "Every species in this galaxy evolved to run from predators," he said. "Your people, the Cathari, you were prey animals once, and you evolved to hide, and to think, and to negotiate, and that is beautiful, and I respect it." He turned and looked at Thalric, and his eyes were dark and steady, and impossibly deep. "But we did not evolve that way," he said. "We were prey, and then we became the predators, and we did not become predators by accident. And we clawed our way to the top of a food chain, on a world that tried to kill us every single day. And we learned to fight, and to hunt, and to endure. And then we learned something even more important." "What was that?" Thalric asked. "Stop," Asante said. "That is what makes us different from the Vraxians, and they are all instinct and all hunger, and they cannot choose to stop, and we can. And we choose when to fight, and we choose when to show mercy, and we choose when to unleash everything we are. And tomorrow, Observer, we are going to choose violence, and I want you to be ready for what that looks like." Thalric was not ready. He knew that then, and he would know it even more in the hours to come. The fleet dropped out of faster-than-light travel the next morning, and the bridge of the Relentless went quiet. And Thalric stood in his designated observation position near the back wall, and he looked at the main display screen, and his skin went so white it was almost transparent. The Vraxian Hive Fleet filled the entire screen. 80 warships, massive and dark, and covered in organic armor that looked like the shells of enormous beetles. And around them swarmed thousands of fighter drones like clouds of insects, and the whole formation pulsed and shifted and moved like a single living organism. And it was the most terrifying thing Thalric had ever seen in his life. The bridge was silent for exactly 3 seconds. Then Captain Vargas leaned forward in her command chair and said, "All hands battle stations, and let's go hunting." And the crew of the Relentless cheered again, and Thalric gripped his datapad so hard it cracked. And he thought to himself that he was about to die surrounded by madmen on a ship full of predators who were charging straight into the jaws of death. The first 10 minutes of the Battle of the Shroud Expanse destroyed everything Thalric thought he knew about war and about humans, and about what was possible when a species decided that retreat was not an option. The Vraxians attacked the way they always attacked, and the way they had attacked a dozen civilizations before this one, and it was simple and brutal and effective. And they sent the swarm forward first, thousands of fighter drones pouring out of the carrier ships like a river of black chitin and razor wings. And behind the swarm came the capital ships, massive and slow, and bristling with plasma batteries, ready to hammer anything the drones did not finish. Against any concordant species, this would have been the end, because concordance doctrine said that when you are outnumbered, you fell back and regrouped and negotiated and hoped for mercy. The humans did not fall back. Captain Vargas gave one order, and the order was forward, and the 12 ships of human battle group accelerated directly into the swarm, and Thalric grabbed the nearest console to steady himself, because the Relentless surged forward with a force that pressed him back against the wall, and the engines screamed like living things. "What are they doing?" he whispered to nobody, and nobody answered, because everyone on the bridge was busy doing their jobs with a calm, focused intensity that made his head spin. The human fleet split into 3 groups like the prongs of a trident, and they drove straight into the heart of the Vraxian formation, and the tactic was called the Maw. And Thalric would later learn that it was designed to do one thing, and that thing was to break the swarm apart from the inside, and create overlapping fields of fire where every human gun could shoot in every direction without hitting a friendly ship. It worked. The moment the human ships entered the swarm, the point defense systems activated, and Thalric had never seen anything like it. And he never wanted to see anything like it again. Every human ship was covered in automated gun turrets that fired so fast the individual shots blurred into solid lines of light, and the sound, even through the hull, was a continuous roar like thunder that never stopped. And the Vraxian drones died by the hundreds and then by the thousands, and they burst apart in flashes of orange and white, and their shattered bodies tumbled through space in expanding clouds of debris. The main display showed the battle from above, and Thalric watched the 3 human formations carve through the swarm like hot blades through ice, and everywhere they went, they left trails of destruction. And the swarm tried to close around them, and every time it did, the humans adjusted and the kill zone shifted, and more drones died. "Concentrate fire on the carrier at bearing 072, Vargas said, and her voice was calm and steady, as if she were ordering a meal, and not directing the destruction of an enemy warship. Tell the Ironhide and the Blackwater to focus their batteries and bring it down." 2 human destroyers turned in unison and opened fire on a Vraxian carrier 10 times their size, and their combined weapons fire punched through the organic hull in seconds, and the carrier broke apart from the inside, and something inside it exploded, and for a moment there was a new sun in the shroud expanse, burning white and hot, and then it was gone, and where the carrier had been, there was only dust. But the Vraxians were not finished, and they adapted too, in their own terrible way, and they sent the drones in tighter and faster, and some of them got through the point defense grid and latched onto the hulls of human ships, and began cutting through the armor with their mandibles and acid, and this was the part that Thalric would remember in his nightmares for the rest of his life. Because the humans went outside to fight them. Marines in powered combat armor climbed out of airlocks and onto the hulls of their own ships in the vacuum of space, with nothing between them and the void except their suits, and they fought the Vraxian drones hand-to-hand on the skin of the Relentless. Thalric watched on a hull camera as a Marine grabbed the drone twice her size by one of its wings and ripped it off, and then drove a combat knife into the thing's head and kicked its body away into space. And she did this while standing on the hull of a ship that was traveling at combat speed through an active battle. And she did not hesitate, and she did not slow down, and when she finished, she moved on to the next one. Another Marine had his suit breached, and his arm was exposed to vacuum, and the skin froze and cracked, and he kept fighting with his other arm, and used an anchor bolt to pin a drone to the hull, and then smashed its face in with his helmet. Thalric was shaking so badly that his datapad rattled against the console, and his skin had gone beyond white, into a color that Cathari did not have a name for, because no Cathari had ever been this afraid. A human frigate called the Caldera took heavy damage on the port side, and its engines were failing, and it was listing to one side, venting atmosphere, and Thalric thought this was the moment when the humans would begin to lose, because a ship that damaged was finished, and everyone knew it. But the Caldera did not stop. Instead, it turned toward the largest Vraxian carrier in the formation and accelerated, and Thalric realized what was happening a full 10 seconds before it happened. And he opened his mouth to say something, but no sound came out. The caldera rammed the Vraxian carrier at full speed. The collision was catastrophic, and the human frigate punched into the carrier's hull like a fist through paper. And then its reactor detonated, and the explosion consumed both ships in a fireball that expanded outward for kilometers, and 3 nearby Vraxian destroyers were caught in the collision, blast, and shattered. And Thalric later learned that the crew of the caldera had already evacuated to escape pods before the ramming run, because they had planned this, and they had volunteered for it. And the captain of the caldera had been the last one off, and he had aimed the ship by hand before ejecting. This was not desperation, and this was not a last resort, and this was a calculated tactic. And the humans had turned their own dying ship into a weapon, because that is what humans did, and they turned everything into a weapon. The battle shifted after that, because the Vraxians had never encountered an enemy that would deliberately sacrifice a ship as an offensive weapon, and their coordination faltered, and gaps appeared in their formation, and the humans exploited every single one. And then the Vraxian breaching pod hit the Relentless. Thalric felt the impact before he heard it, and the whole ship shuddered, and the lights flickered, and then the alarms started screaming. And a voice on the intercom said, "Hull breach, Deck 7, Section 12, we have boarders." And the bridge crew did not panic, and they did not even look surprised. And Vargas simply said, "Sergeant Major Asante, take your team and handle it." Thalric should have stayed on the bridge, but he did not, and he followed because something in him needed to see and needed to understand. And he ran through the corridors after Asante and his marines. And he could hear the sounds of the Vraxians ahead of them, a clicking, screeching sound that made his skin crawl. They were enormous, the Vraxian shock troops standing 8 feet tall, with 4 arms and armored exoskeletons and mandibles that could cut through steel. And they had poured out of the breaching pod into the corridors of the Relentless, and they were killing everything they found. Asante did not slow down, and he did not give a speech, and he did not hesitate, and he simply raised his weapon and fired, and his marines fired with him. The corridor became a storm of plasma and metal and noise. But it was not enough to just shoot them, because the Vraxians were tough, and they were fast, and they kept coming, and one of them charged through the gunfire, and reached the marine line. And that was when Thalric saw what humans could do, up close. Asante dropped his rifle and met the Vraxian with his bare hands. The creature was twice his size and had 4 arms and an exoskeleton that could stop bullets. And Asante grabbed it by the throat plates and squeezed, and the Vraxian thrashed and slashed and cut his armor open across the chest. But Asante did not let go, and he squeezed harder and harder until something cracked, and the Vraxian went limp, and he threw it aside like garbage, and picked up his rifle, and kept moving forward. Thalric vomited on the deck, and then he wiped his mouth, and picked up his datapad, and kept recording, because that was his job, and because someone needed to tell the galaxy what he was seeing. The battle lasted 19 hours. By the end of it, the Vraxian fleet was broken, and what was left of it tried to run. And Vargas watched them on the display, and said 2 words that Thalric would never forget. No runners. The human ships pursued, and the killing continued, and Thalric stood on the bridge and watched, and understood at last what he was seeing. And it was not a battle, and it was not a war. It was a message. And the message was simple and clear, and written in fire across the shroud expanse, for every species in the galaxy to read. Do not touch what belongs to us. When the guns finally went silent, Thalric stood on the bridge of the Relentless and looked at the main display, and tried to make sense of what he was seeing. But his mind kept sliding away from it, the way a hand slides off a hot surface. The shroud expanse was full of wreckage. 80 Vraxian warships had entered this region of space, and 3 had escaped, and the rest were gone, and they were dust and debris, and shattered husks of organic armor, tumbling slowly through the void, and among them floated the bodies of Vraxian soldiers, thousands upon thousands of them, drifting in the silence of space, with their forearms spread wide, and their mandibles frozen open in death. The human battle group had lost 4 ships and 1,614 people, and Thalric had watched the numbers climb on the casualty display throughout the battle. And each number was a person, and each person had been alive 19 hours ago, and now they were not. Numbers down carefully on his datapad, and his hands were still shaking, and he noticed that there was dried vomit on the front of his observation uniform, and he did not bother to clean it. Captain Vargas sat in her command chair, and she had not moved from that chair in 19 hours, and she looked tired in a way that went deeper than physical exhaustion. And she stared at the display for a long time, and then she stood up and said, "Stand down from battle stations and begin search and rescue operations. And I want every escape pod found and every survivor recovered, and we leave no one behind." The crew moved instantly, and there was no celebration, and there was no cheering, and the eagerness that Thalric had seen before the battle was gone now, and in its place was something heavy and quiet and gray, and it took him a moment to recognize it, because he had never seen it on human faces before. It was grief. Thalric spent the next several hours wandering the ship in a daze, and everywhere he went he saw the cost of what had happened, and the corridors near the breach point on Deck 7 were scorched and dented, and there was blood on the walls, both red human blood and the dark green ichor of the Vraxians, and repair crews were already working to seal the damaged sections. But they worked in silence, and nobody spoke. He passed the medical bay, and the doors were open, and he could see inside, and what he saw made him stop and lean against the wall, because the room was full, and there were wounded soldiers on every bed and on the floor, and some of them were missing limbs, and some of them were burned, and some of them were just sitting there, staring at nothing with empty eyes. And the medical staff moved between them quickly and quietly, doing what they could. He saw the Marine who had fought on the hull with a frozen arm, and she was lying on a bed, and her arm was gone now, and they had amputated it, and she was awake, and she was looking at the ceiling. There were tears running down her face, but she made no sound at all. Thalric kept walking because he could not stay, and he could not help, and he felt completely and utterly useless. That evening the crew gathered in the main cargo bay for the memorial. It was the largest open space on the ship, and every person who could stand was there, and they stood in rows, shoulder to shoulder, and Thalric found a place at the back, near the wall, and he watched. Captain Vargas stood at the front, on a raised platform, and she held a datapad, and she began to read names. 1,614 names. She read every single one, and she read them slowly and clearly, and she gave each name its own space and its own moment, and the cargo bay was so quiet that Thalric could hear the hum of the ship's engines far below them, and nothing else. Some of the names made people cry, and Thalric could hear the sounds of weeping from different parts of the bay, and he saw Marines who had killed Vraxians without flinching, now holding each other and sobbing openly, and he saw officers who had commanded batteries of weapons that destroyed entire ships, now standing with their heads bowed and their shoulders shaking. Vargas read every name, and her voice cracked twice, and both times she paused and closed her eyes and took a breath, and then she continued, because she was the captain, and the captain finishes. When the last name was read, the bay was silent for a long moment, and then someone began to sing, and it was a low, quiet song that Thalric did not know. And one by one other voices joined in, and it swelled and filled the bay, and it was not a war song, and it was not a victory song, and it was something else, and his translator could not fully capture it, but the emotion needed no translation. These people were saying goodbye to their dead. Thalric stood at the back and watched, and his skin was the color of deep violet, which was the Cathari. Color for an emotion so complex that it had no single name, and it was sadness, and confusion, and awe, and something else, something he could not identify. Later he found himself sitting alone in an empty corridor near the observation deck, and he was staring at the wall, and he did not know how long he had been there, when Sergeant Major Asante found him. The big man sat down beside him on the floor, and there was a bandage across his chest, where the Vraxian had cut him, and he moved slowly and carefully, and he said nothing for a long time, and they just sat together in the quiet. Then Asante said, "You think we are monsters." And Thalric wanted to say no, but he could not, because he was not sure, and he did not want to lie. So instead he said, "I do not know what to think, and I do not know what you are." Asante nodded slowly, as if this was the right answer. "We are not monsters," he said. "Monsters do not cry for the dead, and monsters do not read every name, and monsters do not hold each other in the dark, and grieve for people they will never see again." He paused and looked at Thalric, and his eyes were wet, and Thalric realized with a shock that this man who had crushed a Vraxian's throat with his bare hands was crying. "We are something worse than monsters, observer," Asante said quietly. "We are people who know exactly what we are, and we know what we can do, and what it costs, and we do it anyway, because someone has to stand between the darkness and the people who cannot fight it themselves, and that is the burden we carry, and we carry it willingly, and it breaks us, and we carry it still." Thalric did not trust himself to speak. The next day, he took a shuttle down to the surface of Mara's landing, because he needed to see it, and he needed to understand what had been saved. The colony was a modest place, with a small city and farming settlements spread across a green valley, and it was beautiful in a simple way, with white buildings, open fields, and a river that caught the light of the local star and sparkled. People were going about their lives, and they knew about the battle, and they knew what had happened in orbit above their heads. But life continued, because life always continues, and Thalric walked through the city streets and watched them. He saw a man opening a shop and putting out a sign, and he saw two women sitting at a table outside a cafe, drinking something and talking, and he saw children. The children were playing in a park, and they were running and laughing and chasing each other, and they had no idea how close they had come to dying, and they would never know the full truth of what had happened above them, and that was the point, and that was the entire point. A little girl broke away from the group and ran up to him because he was obviously alien and obviously interesting, and she looked up at him with wide, curious eyes and said, "Are you one of the aliens who came to watch?" He said, "Did the soldiers win?" "Yes," he said, and his voice was barely a whisper. "They won." She smiled a huge bright smile that had no shadows in it and no grief, and no knowledge of what that victory had cost. And she said, "Good," and then she ran back to her friends. Thalric stood in the park and watched the children play, and he wept, and he did not try to stop himself, and his tears were clear like water, and they fell on the grass of a world that was still alive, because 1,614 humans had died to keep it that way. That night he sat in his quarters on the shuttle and opened his datapad, and he was supposed to write a report about Vraxian fleet capabilities and tactical patterns, and that is what the Concordance had asked for, and that is what they expected. He deleted the standard report template. He stared at the blank screen for a long time, and then he began to write. "The Concordance has made a critical error in its assessment of humanity." He paused, and then he kept writing, and the words came fast now, because he knew what he needed to say, and he knew that the galaxy needed to hear it, and he wrote through the night and into the morning, and he did not stop. The High Council Chamber of the Galactic Concordance was the oldest room in the known galaxy, and it had stood for 60,000 years, carved into the heart of a hollowed moon, orbiting a star so ancient that it had forgotten how to burn bright. And the chamber was enormous, large enough to hold representatives of all 31 elder species, and their attendants and advisors. And it was designed to make anyone who stood at its center feel very small. Thalric Vosinai stood at its center, and he did not feel small. He had felt small once, and that felt like a lifetime ago, and it had been only weeks since he had boarded the Relentless as a nervous young analyst with translucent skin that glowed blue with anxiety. And now he stood before the most powerful beings in the galaxy, and his skin was steady and calm, and showed no color at all, which for a Cathari was the color of absolute certainty. The council members watched him from their elevated seats, arranged in a vast semicircle that rose up and up into the shadows above. And there were the Cathari, his own people, tall and pale and composed. And there were the Morvathi, with their 6 legs and crystal eyes. And there were the Den Sorath, who communicated through bioluminescent patterns on their skin. And there were dozens of other species that had ruled this region of the galaxy since before humanity had learned to make fire. Senior Analyst Dremic sat in the Cathari section, and he looked nervous. And Thalric understood why. Because Dremic had expected a standard tactical report on Vraxian fleet composition. And instead, Thalric had submitted something very different, and the title alone had caused a storm. "Observer Vosinai," said the council speaker, a massive Gorath, whose voice resonated through the chamber like a struck bell. "You have submitted a report titled Reclassification of Species, Humanity from Tier 6 Primitive Spacefaring to Tier 1 Apex Threat and Critical Ally. Agreed to hear your testimony before making a determination, and you may proceed." A murmur ran through the chamber, because Tier 1 had only ever been assigned to 2 species in galactic history, and one of those species had destroyed itself in a war so devastating that the radiation still poisoned 3 star systems, and the idea of assigning that classification to the humans, whom most council members still thought of as clever animals with loud ships, was apparently absurd. Thalric did not care what they thought. "Honored Council," he began, and his voice was steady and clear. "I was sent to observe the humans in battle against a Vraxian hive fleet, and I was sent because the Concordance wanted intelligence on Vraxian capabilities, and the humans were considered incidental to that mission. And I was told, and I quote, that I would be documenting a massacre, and that I should prepare myself emotionally because the humans would all die." He paused and looked around. Chamber. "The Concordance was correct that I would be documenting a massacre," he said, "but the Concordance was wrong about who would be massacred." The chamber went quiet. Thalric activated his holographic display, and the battle of the Shroud Expanse appeared in the air above him, rendered in perfect detail from his observation records. And the council watched as 12 human ships charged into a fleet of 80 Vraxian warships, and what followed made several of the delegates physically recoil. He let the recording play for several minutes, and then he froze it and began his analysis. "First," he said, "adaptability, and during this single engagement, the human commander Captain Lucia Vargas restructured her battle strategy 3 times in response to changing conditions, and she did this in real time, under fire, while her ship was being boarded. And I want the Council to understand what this means, because no concordant species has ever demonstrated this capability. Recorded military history and our tactical doctrines are rigid and pre-planned, and when they fail, we retreat. But the humans do not retreat, and when their plans fail, they simply make new plans instantly and creatively, and this makes them unpredictable, and an unpredictable enemy is the most dangerous kind." He saw the delegates shifting in their seats. "Second," he continued, "physical endurance, and the human soldiers fought continuously for 19 hours without relief, and their physiology allows them to operate under conditions of extreme stress, injury, and fatigue that would incapacitate any known concordant species. And I personally witnessed a Marine continue fighting after her arm was exposed to hard vacuum. And I personally witnessed another Marine fight with injuries that would have killed a Cathari 3 times over. And they did not stop, and they could not be stopped. And this is because humans evolved on a high-gravity death world where everything was trying to kill them. And they are built to survive damage that would destroy us. He advanced the recording to the boarding action, and the chamber fell silent as they watched Sergeant Major Asante crush a Vraxian war captain with his bare hands. Third, he said, controlled aggression, and this is the most important point I will make today, and I need every member of this council to hear it clearly. He paused, and the silence was absolute. The Vraxians are aggressive because they cannot help it, and their violence is instinctual and uncontrolled, and they destroy because destruction is all they know. But the humans are different, and their violence is not instinctual, and it is chosen and it is aimed, and it can be turned on and turned off like a weapon system. And the same man you just watched kill a Vraxian with his bare hands sat with me later that evening and discussed philosophy, and wept for his fallen comrades. And this is what makes humans more dangerous than the Vraxians could ever be. Because the Vraxians are slaves to their aggression, but the humans are masters of theirs. He saw Dremix staring at him with wide eyes, and he did not care. Fourth, he said, psychological resilience, and the humans lost 1,614 people in this battle, and they mourned every single one, and their captain read every name aloud, and the soldiers wept openly and held each other and grieved. And then the next morning they got up and went back to work, and they carried that grief with them, and it did not break them, and it did not slow them, and they added it to the weight they already carried, and they kept moving forward. And any species that can do that, any species that can absorb that kind of loss and remain functional, is a species that cannot be defeated by attrition. He took a breath. And fifth, he said, and his voice dropped lower, the will to protect. And this is the thing the Concordance does not understand, and this is the thing that changes everything. And the humans did not fight this battle for territory, or resources, or political advantage. And they fought it because 1.2 million civilians were going to die if they did not. And most of those civilians were strangers, and the soldiers had never met them and would never meet them. And they fought and bled and died for people they did not know. He looked around the chamber slowly, meeting the eyes of every delegate he could see. Any species that will die for strangers, he said, is capable of anything. And I mean that in both the most wonderful and the most terrifying way possible. The chamber was still and silent, and Thalric could hear his own heartbeat. Honored Council, he said, I have one recommendation, and it is this. The Concordance can do one of two things. We can recognize humanity as the most valuable ally this galaxy has ever known, and we can treat them with the respect and partnership they have earned, as equals, or SP. He paused. Or we can continue to call them primitives, and we can continue to ignore them, and we can continue to believe that we are superior, and we can pray that they never have a reason to turn that fury toward us. Because I have seen what 12 of their ships did to 80 Vraxian warships, and I have seen their marines fight in the void with knives, and I have seen them weep for their dead and stand back up, and I have walked through a colony full of living children who exist because humans chose to die for them. His voice was the only sound in the chamber. They are not primitives, he said. They are the apex predator of a death world, and they have taught themselves mercy, and I am begging this council not to mistake that mercy for weakness, because it is the only thing standing between us and what I saw in the Shroud Expanse. He stopped speaking, and the silence lasted for a very long time, and then slowly, one by one, the delegates began to discuss among themselves, and the chamber filled with the sound of 31 species trying to process what they had just heard. The vote took 3 days, and it was not unanimous, but it did not need to be. Humanity was reclassified to Tier 1. And 6 weeks later, Thalrik Voss and I stood in the passenger lounge of a diplomatic transport, watching through the viewport as the ship entered the Sol system. And he was no longer a military observer, because the Concordance had created a new position for him. He was now the first Concordance ambassador to humanity. The Sol system was quiet and ordinary, and the star was yellow and medium-sized and unremarkable in every way. And the third planet from that star was small and blue-green, with white clouds, and it looked fragile from this distance, like something that could break if you held it wrong. Thalrik knew better now. He knew that this fragile little world had produced a species that could crush a Vraxian's throat with bare hands and then cry about it afterward. And he knew that they had music that shook walls and knives they sharpened, even though they had plasma weapons. And he knew that they would charge into impossible odds, not because they did not understand the danger, but because someone behind them needed protecting. He smiled, and it was a human gesture that he had picked up without realizing it, and it felt strange on his Kethari face. But it also felt right. "What a terrifying, beautiful species," he said quietly to himself. And then the transport began its descent toward Earth, and Thalrik Voss and I prepared to meet humanity not as an observer this time, but as a friend. And somewhere in the shroud expanse, the wreckage of 80 Vraxian warships drifted in the silence between dead stars. And it would drift there for 1,000 years, and every species that passed through that region of space would see it, and would know what had happened here, and would understand the message that had been written in fire and blood and sacrifice.